clock struck midnight as I stepped off the bus, the hiss of the hydraulic doors sounding like a sinister whisper in the chilly night air. The small town of Ravensbrook lay ahead, shrouded in an eerie fog that curled around the old weathered buildings like ghostly fingers. It was my first visit here, summoned by an urgent letter from my estranged uncle, claiming he was in grave danger. The message was cryptic, filled with half-told secrets and a plea for help, a far cry from the distant and aloof man I barely remembered from my childhood. The cobblestone streets were deserted, each step echoing through the silence like the tolling of a bell. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. My breath formed clouds in the frigid air as I pulled my coat tighter, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I could feel eyes watching from the darkened windows of the houses, though no faces appeared. The sense of unease grew with every step toward my uncle's dilapidated mansion on the edge of town. The mansion loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the moonlit sky. Ivy clung to its walls like veins, and the once grand facade was now crumbling and forlorn. I hesitated at the wrought iron gate, which creaked open with a rusty protest. The garden, overgrown and wild, seemed to swallow the pathway leading to the front door. As I approached, a sudden gust of wind rattled the bare branches of an ancient oak, and I swore I heard a faint whisper carried on the breeze. My uncle's letter had mentioned a key hidden beneath a loose stone on the porch. The stone was easy enough to find, but as I lifted it, a chill ran down my spine. The key was cold, almost unnaturally so, and I could feel a strange vibration in my fingers as I picked it up. The door groaned open, revealing a darkened hallway that smelled of dust and decay. The air inside was stagnant, as if it had not been disturbed for years. I fumbled for a light switch, finding none. My phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and furniture draped in white sheets like specters frozen in time. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. I made my way to the study where my uncle said he would be waiting. The door was ajar and I pushed it open with a sense of foreboding. The study was a chaos of papers and books, strewn about as if a great struggle had taken place. In the center of the room stood my uncle, or rather, what was left of him. His body was contorted, eyes wide open in a rictus of terror, mouth agape in a silent scream. Blood had pooled around him, but what struck me most was the look of sheer horror etched onto his face. He had been clutching a book, now smeared with blood, its pages filled with strange symbols and drawings that seemed to shift and writhe under my gaze. I felt bile rise in my throat as I staggered back, the reality of the scene crashing down on me. Suddenly the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in. I spun around, convinced I was not alone, but there was no one there, just the oppressive darkness and the overwhelming sense of dread. I had to get out, to call for help, but as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the handle, yanking it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing grew rapid and the flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that made the shadows dance wildly. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. There had to be another way out. The windows were boarded up, and the only other door led to the basement, a place I had no desire to explore. A sound behind me made me freeze. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Like a voice carried on the wind, I turned slowly, the flashlight revealing the source. The book my uncle had been holding was now open, pages fluttering, as if caught in an invisible breeze. The symbols on the pages glowed faintly, and the whispering grew louder, forming words I could not understand. I felt drawn to the book, an inexplicable compulsion pulling me closer. As I reached out to touch it, a sharp pain shot through my hand and I recoiled. A thin cut had appeared on my palm, blood welling up and dripping onto the pages. The book absorbed the blood, the symbols glowing brighter, and the whispering crescendoed into a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. The room began to spin, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, the voices growing louder, more insistent. Everything went black. When I awoke, I was no longer in the study. I found myself in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The walls were rough stone, cold and unforgiving, and the only light came from flickering torches set into the walls. Chains hung from the ceiling, and strange markings covered the floor, forming a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, my head pounding with a dull ache. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea how I had ended up here. The last thing I remembered was the book, the blood, and the voices. A sense of dread settled over me as I struggled to my feet, the realization dawning that I was far from safety. I needed to find a way out, but the only exit was a narrow passageway that led deeper into the darkness. With no other options, I took a deep breath and began to walk, the torches casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The passage twisted and turned, the air growing colder with each step. I could hear a faint dripping sound, the rhythmic plink of water echoing through the corridor. My footsteps seemed to grow louder, reverberating in the confined space, as if the darkness itself was amplifying the sound. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and I gasped at the sight before me. The room was filled with ancient artifacts and relics, strange and otherworldly, each one exuding an aura of malevolence. At the center of the room stood an altar, carved from black stone, and upon it lay the book. It was open, the pages glowing with a sickly green light, the symbols shifting and writhing as if alive. As I approached, the voices returned, louder and more insistent than before. They called to me, urging me to read, to understand the secrets contained within the pages. I resisted, fear gripping my heart, but the compulsion was too strong. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as my fingers touched the book, a shock ran through me, and the world around me seemed to dissolve. I was no longer in the chamber. I found myself standing on the edge of a vast, dark abyss, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. The sky above was a swirling mass of storm clouds, lightning flashing in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and decay, and the ground was littered with bones. In the distance, I could see a figure standing on the edge of the abyss, watching me. I took a step forward, the ground shifting beneath me, and the figure raised a hand, beckoning me closer. As I approached, I could see that it was my uncle, his face twisted in agony. He spoke, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible over the howling wind. "You must destroy the book," he said, his eyes pleading. "It holds the power to unleash unspeakable horrors. You must end this." Before I could respond, the ground gave way, and I was falling, tumbling into the darkness. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was my uncle's voice, repeating the same words over and over. "Destroy the book. Destroy the book." I awoke with a start, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I was back in the chamber, lying on the cold stone floor. The book still lay on the altar, its pages glowing ominously. The voices had quieted, but their presence lingered, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of touching the book again filled me with dread. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking, and approached the altar. My uncle's words echoed in my mind, urging me to destroy the book. But how? It seemed almost indestructible, its ancient pages pulsing with a dark energy. I needed to find a way, and quickly before the voices returned and overwhelmed me. As I searched the room, my eyes fell on a large iron candlestick, its base sharpened to a point. It was heavy and solid, and I knew it could serve as a makeshift weapon. I grabbed it, the cold metal reassuring in my hands, and returned to the altar. With a deep breath, I raised the candlestick and brought it down on the book with all my strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and the book seemed to scream, the symbols flashing brightly before dimming. I struck again and again, each blow resonating with a sense of finality. The pages tore, the cover split, and the glowing light began to fade. The voices rose in a cacophony of anger and despair, but I continued, driven by a determination I hadn't known I possessed. Finally, the book lay in tatters, the symbols fading into nothingness. The voices ceased and an eerie silence settled over the room. I dropped the candlestick, my hands trembling, and took a step back. The oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was done. The book was destroyed. But my ordeal was far from over. A rumble shook the chamber, and I looked around in panic as the walls began to crumble. The floor cracked and shifted, and I stumbled, struggling to keep my balance. I had to get out before the entire place collapsed. I turned and ran back through the passageway, the ground shaking beneath my feet, debris falling around me. I burst into the open air just as the entrance to the chamber caved in, a cloud of dust and debris billowing out. Gasping for breath, I collapsed to my knees, the adrenaline draining from my body. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. As I lay there catching my breath, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was my uncle, but not as I had seen him before. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a sinister smile played on his lips. He approached slowly, and I realized with growing horror that the destruction of the book had not freed him, but had instead unleashed something far worse. "You should have listened," he said, his voice echoing with a strange, otherworldly resonance. "You should have left it alone." Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands closing around my throat. I struggled, but his grip was iron, and I could feel my strength fading. Darkness encroached on my vision, and I knew I was about to die. In a final, desperate effort, I reached for a shard of stone and plunged it into his side. He screamed, a terrible, inhuman sound, and released me. I scrambled away, gasping for air, and watched as his form began to dissolve, the glow in his eyes flickering and fading. With a final, ear-piercing shriek, he disappeared, leaving only a pile of ash behind. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind reeling from the events of the night. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and made my way back to town. The streets were still deserted, the fog thick and unyielding. I had survived, but the horrors of Ravensbrook would stay with me forever. As I boarded the next bus out of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. The book was gone, but the darkness it had unleashed was far from defeated. I knew that wherever I went, the shadows of Ravensbrook would follow, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of perception. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still, I could still hear the faint whispering of the voices, a haunting echo of the nightmare I had escaped.